So, good morning, everybody. First, I'd like to thank the committee members of BAMM for inviting me to speak, and in particular, the Scottish committee for this wonderful setup they've given us today. I'm going to talk about making mosaics for Tottenham Court Road station with Paolozzi, and I hope people can hear me. Closer? Louder? So first, I remember about 34 years ago in 1983, I was a seemingly callow young man, about in my late 20s, and we were aware that there was an opportunity to present ideas for making the second stage of mosaics for Tottenham Court Road tube station. So, what we knew was that there had been some mosaics already installed in 1982, and these had been made in Italy by a company called Ital Mosaic, but that there were problems with the work that had been done, and they wanted to look for new manufacturers. This is an example of some of the mosaic there. And you can see it's done in two very different styles. One is in a mixture of piastre, or the smalto tile, so to speak, made from cutting down the pizzas from which the smalto is made, and smalto itself. And the rest is made out of what we call vitreous glass mosaic, which are 2 centimeter squares. And you can see that they're made on a grid. So there's no cutting involved, and therefore it's much faster. Here's another example. And you can see they're quite different styles. One is imposed on the other. Originally, London Transport, they wanted a way of identifying which parts, or rather the quality of the mosaic. And so they understood that smalto was the best material. And in the case of the central line, I think they wanted 15% of it to be smalto. This was taken to mean 15% of the figured areas by the Italians. It sort of failed to get through, really, to be in smalto and piastre, and the rest to be in vitreous glass, done on a grid, which led to all sorts of other problems. So, in addition, they had a whole list of requirements, but from the mosaicist point of view, the main points were that the finished surface must be flat. They didn't want the mosaic to be knocked out by passing suitcases, as indeed has happened in the central line and things, or people, and they didn't want people to be cut by the glass edges. The mosaic must be made only from vitreous glass and smalti, and the minimum percentage of smalti for each mosaic mural must be adhered to. These are examples of the grids that are used to make the bulk of the central line work. And they're a bit old. You can even see Udney, rest in peace, on one of those, I think. And this is not a design, it's just an example to show how they're used. Later, you'd have a pre-cut piece of paper, which you would glue up and stick on top, and you can mass produce, so to speak, in this way. And the result is that many of Paolozzi's drawings were lost, or the detail was lost. So, for instance, at the bottom here, this section, this is meant to be a reel of tape, magnetic tape, say, and a tape recorder, reel-to-reel tape recorders that used to be around at the time. But it's lost a lot of its definition. And over here, this is meant to be a hexagon, and this, well, it's difficult to see what it was. Now, I had to do some kind of presentation to Paolozzi and the architects, and so I did a bit of research. And I discovered that the design was made up of a collage of Paolozzi's drawings, cut up into sections and placed in for this next section, which is called, well, at the time it was called a drum, later became known as the rotunda. And this was the first project I was involved with. The design indeed was, I went to collect at the Royal College of Art because I had to assess it. And somewhat worryingly, the sort of people who gave me the mosaic, well, Eduardo wasn't there, the drawing rather, told me that he always fell out with his collaborators. So that just increased my nervous disposition. But however, I studied a lot of these prints, and I realized that the information that really Eduardo was after was the images that are contained in these prints and what they mean and what they represent, and that coloring was a less important part. For instance, you can see these are both the same print, both the same line drawing, but they're colored quite differently. So it is the individual pieces that he's showing that he wants to see represented. Thus, when people said of the central line, oh, it's so colorful, he would somewhat recoil because that's not what he wanted. He didn't see himself as an abstract artist. So this is an example of the artwork that I was given to prepare. And I went to Paolozzi, I made my suggestions based on maintaining his lines, intermixing the smalto and the vitreous glass so that it would act in conjunction with each other and increase the textural ranges of each, and thereby embellishing the mosaic. This went down reasonably well, so we got the job. And the first sections we started on were these these bits around the entrances, which we called ticker tape, quite wrongly, because in fact they represent the sort of punch cards that were used to feed information into early computers. And you may know this kind of thing from the Hanging Chad episodes of 2000. And so next, here we are doing some samples. This is George, Curly as we used to call him. And you can see sometimes it doesn't always go right. He's pulled some bits off the paper there. It happens to all of us. Here you can see a bit more detail. So this is all in reverse on paper. And we're intermixing smalto, mainly here forming the border. And for this purpose, I made up a dark smalto mix, which I wanted to seem or be reminiscent of magnetic tape, which is a big feature of technology at that time, in video cassettes, for instance, or computer memories. They were held on big banks of reel-to-reel tape recorders. Although new technology was coming in, and the old humble cassette tape, or the 8-track. And then we made some new color mixes, which I wanted to be more, less vibrant and more miscible, but not detract from the drawing particularly, just enhance it, so it's clear what the drawing's of. That's Gino on the left. So this is a bit, that's up there now, and you can see the different kinds of color mixes. So there's a sort of fairly subtle green mix. There's a pink and grey mix. I was very fond of my pink and grey mixes. I had quite a few of them. And then there's a brown mix. Here we got a particular kind of vitreous glass that had a great deal of variation in it itself, so we used that straight. And then this is a section readied. Eduardo came round and in his studio gear, so he's wearing a scruffy old jumper. Don't know if you've seen photographs of him, but he did look a formidable chap. And dirty corduroys, belt hanging down by his knees. Gino went to answer the door. He said, "Oi, the bin's around the back, mate." But fortunately, I managed to catch it just in time before it went to catastrophe. And he came in and he was happy, so on we went. So this is now one of these entranceways. If you imagine yourself in this rotunda, if you've not been there, imagine yourself, say, shrunk to the size of an ant, placed inside a tuna tin. And you're looking at the walls, that's something like the shape of it. This entranceway is a single entranceway and a smaller one, and that as it is now, complete. The second double entranceway, which is also completed up there, and as it is at present. You can see a young traveller thinking to himself, who is that fool with the camera? Anyway, so on either side, between these entranceways, there are two mural spaces, although the whole thing is designed to be an integral whole. This is a study for the slightly larger space, and Eduardo gave this to me afterwards. It's actually flipped left to right to how it is in existence, on the walls, and slightly tilted down on the right. And one you might see, he dedicated it to me. Whether he made this after or before is still a question I don't know the answer to. And this is the actual detail of the design as I was given it. You should be able to see here the cut-up pieces of paper, which were applied with glory glue, the paper, to the cardboard, which had been prepared by the architects. So, there are quite a few, as we all find, little design line guides you have to have, and when you're working with a number of people, you have to make it clear that you get a consistent result, and you have to communicate these things. It's actually quite a good exercise because it helps you clear your mind about what's needed. So the magnetic tape mix, which is this black smelter, I wanted to use throughout the composition to unify as boundary lines, to unify the elements, because many of the elements had different colors for the boundaries and things like this. And I wanted to make it seem as though it's more coherent, rather than a lot of individual pieces placed, as indeed they were, as a collage, to make it seem more worked and thought out, so to speak. Thank goodness Paolozzi didn't hear me say that, but anyway. Yeah. And then the color mixes, equally to be assigned to balance out throughout the composition. So some colors I changed in order to have a reflective sense of it all around, So the symmetry around the whole surface. So on one side you might have blue, blue, the other side you'd have something like blue, blue mixes, and so on and so forth. So this is the longer side as it is now. And I'll go on to discuss some of the details. So this is one section here. I've been asked to give some explanation as to what all these images are. And they are meant to be multiple interpretations of the kinds of things that people would experience in their everyday life. So in this case, we have a man who appears to have an astrolabe in his brain, and there's some kind of cyborg, perhaps, which you could look at it in many ways, and all are legitimate, according to Eduardo. And he's plugged into some sort of other device, whether that's juxtaposed or plugged in. Again, it's all allowed. These little sections here are reminiscent of simple printed circuit boards. And this area here is meant to be evocative of ethnographic art. At the time, Eduardo was curating an exhibition for the Museum of Mankind, and so he was very interested in ethnographic art. And so this section obviously is clearly of an African type. And here, a mask here, which he called a tribal mask. And I gently hinted, because I didn't want to upset him, the great man, but I think actually I got enough clues out of him that this was a kind of representation of himself. So as a kind of self-portrait in his style, so that here he is looking at you, viewing him, and so on and so forth. So he's like the observer. And there's one on the other side too. Here we have a mechanical chicken, and where we have these areas here, or the piastrelle, or piastrine, we tried to make them all more or less the same size, so they're all fairly proportionate to each other, each piece, rather than have one large piece and then lots of little pieces just to fill into the margin. The mechanical chicken is obviously there, factory farming, egg production, and so on, and also maybe artificial means of producing eggs, etc. This is like a sort of console here, and this is more wheels within wheels, cogs, and so on. This is a representation on the right-hand side of a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and behold, I can use my magnetic tape mix to do magnetic tape with it. So that was a great bonus. And this, for instance, is an architect scale rule. This is another sort of interface, and so on. This is an interesting panel, I think. And on the left-hand side, you can see silver grey mix, a kind of vision of something like a blast furnace or kiln. It's obviously meant to be interchangeable, an industrial process of some kind. And the grey background is a sort of smoggy feel, I think. Contrasting with the right-hand side, which you can see as a sort of cartoonish blue sky, thinking or whatever, Brexit maybe, and a folded section at the bottom. That's one way of interpreting it. But unusual because it has a kind of romantic imagery, not typical of Eduardo. Here, his signature. We actually cut all the pieces and left them out so he could put them in himself, so it would seem a bit more authentic. But he got a bit bored after about 6. So we had to finish it off. And of course in the magnetic tape mix, and of course being magnetic, it would help it stick that little bit better, you know. And on the other side, on the top left, it's clearly, I think, a satellite. Next to it, a panel which evokes animal experimentation. You can see all the tubes going into this poor dog. It isn't smoking a cigarette. But another interpretation of this is a representation of the first and only, I think, canine cosmonaut, Laika. And the dog there, perhaps looking out on Earth as it slowly choked to death. Ah, poor thing. So printed circuit boards, wheels, cogs, and so on. Now to the other side. Again, this representation is flipped horizontally. And again, it's, you know, Eduardo gave it to me afterwards. And that is the design drawing. And this is what it looks like now. I think, although I say it myself, you can see from the design drawing that the colours aren't very vibrant or strong, as indeed the central line design drawing is quite similar. But I have tried to embellish it and change it in a way that would improve it as a mosaic from the drawing. And I think it's a key thing to what you can do with mosaic by mixing textures and colours in a sort of sensible proportion so that it doesn't detract from the main imagery. So this is what it looks like now. And a little bit blurred, probably because of me wobbling. So at the center, this is a rather large section which dominates the side of the wall. At the top, you couldn't really see these before because they had the lighting in front of it. The representation of an architect, perhaps, with his board, or draftsman. Here, maybe a piano keyboard, maybe one of them's a pianist. Various professional people going around. And there is a section of that being made in the workshop. You can see the head here. It's all in reverse, so that clearly makes it a bit difficult to recognize immediately. And for those who are keen on this sort of thing, this is a pig iron block. We used to use these a lot for cutting with, apart from the taglioli. And we used to find that we'd get a better result. And also it would hold the piece more firmly because it's flat, and made it a bit easier to do fine cutting at times, especially with thicker material. We had to source our piastre from Donna. There was only Donna and Orsoni in those days. I suppose it's pretty much the same now, although there are some foreign makers now. But of the piastre, Orsoni wouldn't make us 5mm thick piastre unless we bought enough to do the job about 20 times over for each colour. But Donna would, and so that's where we got the material. We had a difference of thickness to cope with, of 4mm for the vitreous glass up to 10. But because of the method of fixing we use, which was on a thick bed, that could be accommodated. So, moving in a bit closer, you can see, again, the ethnic mask, perhaps Eduardo, and behind a running man. Also, Eduardo did refer to it as the $6 Million Man. The sort of TV cyborg series at the time. Some chap had been injured, half man, half machine, etc., doing improbable things. And this is it in reverse. You might be able to see some of the differences in thicknesses, for instance, along this line. And there it is more closely. There was a problem with the making of this mosaic. Firstly, the area wasn't even created by the time we were starting. So we didn't know the actual final dimensions. And of course, when you do get the final dimensions, you have to be careful when you survey, especially on a curved wall, because it's rarely curved in a circular way. And of course, it wasn't. So I do recommend a survey, because it's best to try and make it to size. Otherwise, disappointment can be the result, especially when it's got to go all the way around and meet up, like a mosaic like this would. The second point is that at the top, the diameter was greater than at the bottom. So a condition called plasterer's elbow. It's harder work to lift it up to the top, so you put a thinner layer on. They might argue that they want it raked ever so slightly backwards so it won't fall down. Well, you know, good excuse. But it does present a problem again. Because we had to have this white background, it was stipulated. I'm not a great lover of white, but in this case I think it works reasonably well because it gives away the collage nature of the work. But it meant we had to fit the white to it and splice it, or, well, not splice it, open it up slightly around the top as we're coming down and do all the cutting, so it's all being done on the bench. Here we have some other images. I think this element here looks a bit like the music-making part of a jewellery box, you know, which you wind up a clockwork jewellery box and play something from Tchaikovsky or something while you look at your paste rings or something. And some kind of industrial process. Now, this is Jane working on another piece, and it's a mixed materials, and this is it up on site. Then, as you come out of the drum or rotunda, you see as though it's going through the walls. Eduardo actually said this, you know, he wants his imagery that appears to be sinking through the wall. A reflection of the ticker tape, the punch cards here, so you can see the punch card there and the punch card there, and also a butterfly. And I asked him about the butterfly, and he said that's because of the nearby bars at Russell Square, Turkish bars, which were frequented very much by the gay community then. And so the butterfly was a sort of cipher, because he saw it as not exactly a slang word, but as a word for homosexuals at the time. And so he's included it here. He did share a flat with Francis Bacon and so on, so he probably knew what he was talking about. Then turning round, these are the new escalators. The previous escalators used to bend more round to the right as we're looking at this. But there's clearly a space at the top. There are 3 entrances, and that space at the top could have accommodated the arches. So I'm sorry about this photograph. It's a scan of a print, but you can see some of the arches being made here, and by Jane again. And these are photographs of it actually on site, which is why the colour levels are so poor, because the lighting is very poor. This is laid out there. It's been cut up into sections, but this is ready for fixing. You always do this if you've got a bit of sense, anyway you do it, because it makes sure, it gives you confidence as well, but it makes sure you get them in the right order. And this is another section. So here, you can maybe see enough. What we have is the andamento running in different directions, different pitches and so on. Partly as an effort to make it more interesting. These panels here were to evoke a visit to the British Museum, and were in a kind of Egyptian style, Eduardo maintained. And so I tried to make it look as though, firstly there's an element of hieroglyphic art and embellishment, cartouches and such, and I tried to emphasize that in smalto, and also by giving these movements in different directions, distinguishing between, say, what you might have as a natural feature and some that have more regular markings, such as this one, might be a man-made feature. So there were 2 arches, mosaics in the Egyptian style, back to back, and this is the right-hand side of the larger one. So you can see these sort of Egyptian-type motifs here. And this area here, I made it look a bit like it was sky, so you could see a window behind, a sort of London sky in the autumn. And then there's a sight of close-up. I'm sorry about the quality of the images. Had I known it was going to be knocked down, I might have taken some more. And that's looking at the other side. So, in fact, they are symmetrical, and it's the same design for each side. It was just adapted. I adapted it to sort of carry on to where it needed to go before it was cut off by the walls. This is a bit later, and a wonderful electric lighting scheme went in. It rather spoiled that one. But you can see the other arch here, and you can also see the symmetrical nature. You can see how this is reflected there, and so on. They could have been saved quite easily, these. All you need to do is sort of cut along a line here of material that I still have. And then, having divided the panels up that way, you could go down behind them because they're all fixed on a steel frame with an expanded metal stainless steel mesh onto which a render was placed, to which we put our fixing. So these are one of the other designs we call the watch strap, because it is meant to imitate a watch strap, and there's a certain kind of Casio watch, which was very popular, digital watch. So as you go through, you'll be looking at this, checking your time. Am I late? Am I on time? Etc. And here I am with Liv Lamanek, who very kindly took me to see and survey the wreckage of what now remains after careful removal by sledgehammer. And what is maybe of interest to some is you can see some of the construction here. So this is the render. The expanded metal is missing, although it's still on some of them. And then you can see across here, my hand's not very steady, that's our bedding layer of sand and cement, into which we've used here a white grout. The reason I use a white grout is because I noticed that I was losing some of the colours. They were toning down disproportionately with the use of Portland cement, which is what we used generally before. And so it's not really for the joints, which I knew would get filthy in an underground station. It's to try and preserve the colours of the mosaic, the vitreous glass particularly. And you can see a bit more clearly in this slide the different thicknesses. So there's 4 mil, this one's about 7 or 8. And so because it's back grouted, you can see that is filled to a more or less even level, and the face is flat, which is a requirement, however desirable or not. I thank Tamara Froud for the hand holding. And here's the last of the sort of major mosaics we did at Tottenham Court Road. We did quite a few extra butterflies and so on. And this time, I've been pushing so that we could enlarge our range of materials to try and include other things. I mean, their problem was that they didn't want to feel that they were being diddled by having cheaper materials. And I managed to persuade them that porcelain might be acceptable. But we could only speak to the architects on site, so they would have to go and speak to the head architects. It would have to be approved by the conservator and the engineers, and then it would go on to London Transport, who would make some sort of decision. So it took about 1.5 years, but yes, they agreed that I could use a bit of porcelain. So, on this one, we called it the Oxford Street entrance, and we also called it the apse, or the arch, and now I believe it's called church window for some reason, because it doesn't look like any church window that I know. But, and then again, you can sort of see the differences in thicknesses here, and Gino pretending to work there. And that's as it is now. When we were making this, Duncan Lamb, the architect, and I discussed, and I had asked him to think of a way of making it removable should it ever be needed. It actually filled in a space where there had been an archway before, and they wanted to block it off because the wind was getting through, and put a mural on instead. And I felt it was necessary to sort of think about this kind of thing, should you want to keep it. So when you're putting a mosaic up, especially if it's a valuable one, you need to think about what you can do if it ever needs moving again. As it happens, fortunately, that was realized, and so it could be moved down to this place in one piece. So he's having a rest here, lying down, but I thought you could see a bit more detail of it. And so you can see this is a special smalto, which I certainly did make for us for another project. We had to buy so much of it, I thought, well, why not use it here? But it has a sandy, very matte finish. And now they do have this as part of their range. Many years later, I noticed. And you can see these are some of the porcelains here, mixed in with the smalto, that's porcelain, and porcelain. This background here is porcelain. This is a watch at the base, so you can see the inner workings of it, very typical of Eduardo. And this, again, you've got the brain plugged into something. Similar idea, some optical, appears to be an artificial eye. And here, here we have a church, something like a church it seems, because of the cross at the top, a skyscraper. And one of the explanations which I asked him about was whether this referred to American evangelism. He didn't say no, so I can assume it possibly means one of the meanings that's acceptable. So you can imagine some big skyscraper with the cross on top. And a spaceship or missile. Here although we had to use the white glass as a background again, so that it would be sympathetic with the other murals. And similarly, I made accommodations for the central line designs so that the whole station would seem to be possibly made by the same people. Mosaic probably knows the differences, but possibly other people don't. Here, anyway, in this background, we did in porcelain. So here, we have another butterfly. This time we're looking at it face on, rather than from the back. But it's not really quite the same. It is different in other features. And given his interpretation, I dread to go into detail. So it's now on this white background. It was designed really to be seen as an individual piece and not in a field. And that's how it was before, with a sort of creamy paint. It enabled the mosaic to stand out better, the contrast work better, when it hasn't got a bright white field around it, which dulls it down. Something to consider, really. And this is where I usually finish up. A bit of OCD, really. And you can see just about, I'm afraid it's a scan of a photograph. There's the Egyptian panels, and this is as you entered the station. These are the watch straps. On the other side, you remember we had these sort of golden yellow ones. On this side, we've got bluey red ones. And there's a young man here wearing what seems to be his big brother's jacket. So I like to remember the station like this. These people hurtling up and down the escalators. And as they go down, their sort of concerns, maybe factory farming, the ecology, the rise of computing, and so on. It's all reflected on the walls around them, their concerns, maybe their hopes. They'd all have different views of it. Equally, things that they hadn't thought of are being shone back to them to make them think about it. So this is all the general sort of popular conceptions and feelings at the time, which I suppose is why they call it pop art. Well, there we are.